Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever walked into a place where the air feels heavy, as if it carries the weight of forgotten lives? That was how I felt when I first set foot in the drowned village. It wasn't just the eerie quiet or the way the land seemed to sink beneath the water's surface. It was something deeper, something that whispered through the rustling of leaves, something that tried to tell me secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. I had been drawn to this place by curiosity, the kind that pulls you into the unknown, the kind that urges you to uncover what's been hidden for so long. The village had been submerged for years, lost beneath the rising waters of the river that had swallowed it whole. They said it was abandoned, forgotten, but I didn't believe it. There was something in the stillness, something in the way the trees grew twisted and crooked, as if they were still holding on to memories of those who had once lived here. It had rained heavily the night before, and the ground was damp beneath my boots. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, but beneath it, there was something else. A strange, metallic scent. It reminded me of the way a place feels before a storm, just before the lightning cracks the sky. But this wasn't a storm. This was something else. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The village was just as I had imagined, or perhaps more so. The houses stood like broken sentinels, their skeletal frames leaning against the weight of time and water. Some were half submerged, their rotting foundations barely visible beneath the murky surface. Others were little more than jagged ruins, their once proud roofs now little more than splintered wood. But it wasn't the ruins that unsettled me. It was the silence. The absolute silence that hung in the air like a shroud. I stepped closer to the water's edge, watching as the ripples slowly spread across the surface. The water was black, like ink spilling over the earth, and for a moment I thought I saw something move beneath it. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination, playing tricks on me. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees, and the sound of the water lapping at the banks filled the space. It was a sound I had heard countless times, yet somehow it didn't seem natural. It felt wrong, like it was trying to tell me something. I took a few more steps, my boots sinking slightly into the mud when I heard it. At first, it was nothing more than a faint murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. I stopped, my heart pounding, straining to hear. The murmur grew louder, more distinct, and then it became clear. It was a voice, but not just any voice. It was the voice of someone who had been lost, someone who had been left behind. Help! I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I spun around, my eyes scanning the village, but there was no one in sight. Just the ruins, the water, the trees. Yet, the voice continued, faint but clear, drifting through the air, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth itself. Please, help me. The voice was pleading now, desperate. It was soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, but there was something in it that made my skin crawl. The kind of desperation that echoes through time, through places that should have been forgotten. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, as though the very ground beneath me had come alive and was holding me captive. The voice seemed to be coming from every direction now, bouncing off the water, reverberating through the trees. I looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Just the same eerie stillness, the same feeling of being watched. The air grew colder. I could see my breath in front of me, a thin mist swirling around my face, even though it was early autumn, far from the freezing cold of winter. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same. The silence now felt heavier, more oppressive, like something was waiting just beyond the edge of my perception. I turned and started walking back toward the center of the village, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. My footsteps echoed too loudly against the quiet, as though they were being amplified by the silence. I passed a few more houses, their doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges, their windows dark and hollow. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step I took. And then I heard it again. A soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I stopped, my heart racing. This time, it was closer. I could feel it, something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. My hand instinctively reached for the camera slung over my shoulder, but the movement only made the sound stop. The world around me fell silent once more. I took another step forward, but this time something caught my eye. In the distance, near the edge of the village, I saw it. A figure. At first, it looked like a person standing in the shadow of a crumbling building, but as I squinted, I realized something was wrong. The figure was wrong. Its outlines seemed to shimmer, as if it was made of the same murky water that filled the village. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. The figure remained still, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Vanished, like smoke in the wind. I stood there for a long moment, the world around me holding its breath. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it tightening around me like a noose. Something was happening here. Something ancient, something that refused to be forgotten. I knew then that the village was not just a place. It was a memory. A memory that refused to stay buried beneath the waters. And that voice, the one that had called out to me from the darkness, was just the beginning. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay. Something was waiting for me. Something that would not let me leave until I had uncovered its secrets. And I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. The wind had picked up, swirling around me like a restless spirit. It made the trees groan as they swayed, their branches twisting unnaturally, as if they too were trying to escape something. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, but underneath it, there was another smell, faint, metallic. It made my stomach churn, but I couldn't tell if it was the water or something deeper in the earth. I turned away from the spot where the figure had vanished, but my legs felt as though they were rooted to the ground. My heart pounded, my pulse a constant drumbeat in my ears. I wanted to leave, to run back to the safety of the town, but something held me here. The village was calling to me, pulling me deeper into its watery grave. The unanswered questions pressed against me, and I knew I couldn't leave until I found the truth. I started walking again, slowly, each step heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to pull me down. The silence was louder now, pressing on me from all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached the center of the village. The remains of houses, barely more than skeletons, loomed around me like dead giants. But something else was there too, a presence, just beyond my sight, hovering like a shadow. And then I heard it. A soft murmur, almost imperceptible. A voice, but not one that came from a person. It was like the wind itself was speaking, and yet the words were clear. You shouldn't be here. The chill that ran down my spine was so cold it left a trace of ice on my skin. The words, though faint, cut through the air, sinking deep into my chest. I froze again, trying to understand. Was it real? Was I hearing things? My breath came faster now, my mind racing as I scanned the area around me. The voice hadn't come from any visible source, but I could feel its presence, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me. It wasn't just the village that was alive with memories, it felt like the very ground beneath me was pulsing with them. I took a step forward, trying to steady myself, but the ground beneath me felt unstable, soft, like it was shifting with every movement I made. The stones that littered the path, the remnants of the old road, seemed to sink deeper into the earth as if they had been waiting for me to step on them. Then I noticed something strange. The water. The water that had once swallowed this village, that still lingered in the foundations of these broken homes, wasn't still. It moved. Not in waves, not like a river or lake, but in slow, deliberate ripples. It was as though the water was breathing. I approached the edge of one of the sunken houses, my feet squelching in the mud. The surface of the water was darker here, deeper, and I could see vague shapes shifting beneath it. For a moment, I thought I saw something move just beneath the surface, a dark shape gliding silently in the depths. I bent closer, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. And then, as if in response to my intrusion, the water seemed to boil, churning violently. I staggered back, heart racing. The surface of the water began to ripple in quick, chaotic motions, as though something large was moving beneath it. And then, as quickly as it had started, the water stilled. The surface was calm once more, like a piece of glass. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't deny it. Something was down there. And it was waiting. I turned, not wanting to look any longer, but something caught my eye. A movement. A flicker. From the corner of my vision, I saw a shadow dart across the entrance of another house. My breath caught in my throat, my entire body stiffening. It was the same figure. The same shimmery outline that had vanished earlier. This time, it was closer, just beyond the threshold of the house. I took a step forward, cautiously, my heart pounding against my ribs. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, outlined in the shadow of the crumbling doorway. And then, a sound, a low groan, as though the very walls of the house were sighing under the weight of time. It was enough to break my paralysis. I stepped back, instinctively, away from the house. But the figure didn't follow me. It remained still, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of here. But the path back was no longer clear. The village had changed. What had once been an open space, the path I had walked before, now felt twisted and distorted. The houses, the trees, the water, it all seemed to be closing in on me, moving, shifting as if it had a mind of its own. The very ground beneath my feet felt like it was pulling me toward the center of the village, toward that spot where the water had boiled and the figure had appeared. The voice returned, this time louder, more insistent. You have to see it. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the air felt thick with it. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just a voice. It was an urge, a pull deep within me that I couldn't explain. The village was alive, and it wanted me to see something, to understand something. I forced myself to walk, step by slow step, back toward the center of the village. Each footfall felt heavier, as though the ground was urging me to stay. I didn't know what I was walking toward, but I knew I couldn't leave until I saw it. And as I approached the heart of the village, the feeling intensified. The very air seemed to tremble, thick with the weight of years of forgotten lives, forgotten tragedies. The memories were rising to the surface, and I was about to be caught in them. But I had no choice. The village wouldn't let me leave. Not yet. Not until I understood what it had to say. I stepped into the water, and everything went black. I awoke to silence. A silence so deep that it almost felt like the world itself had stopped moving. My eyes fluttered open, but the darkness remained thick around me, almost palpable. I tried to push myself up, but the weight of the water felt different now. It wasn't just the physical sensation of being submerged, it was as if the water was part of me, flowing through my veins, carrying me deeper into the heart of something ancient. I gasped, feeling the cold sting of air as my chest heaved with panic. The water was gone, but I was still standing in the village. I could feel it now, something had shifted. The ground beneath my feet was no longer soft, but solid. The crumbling houses around me looked different too, less like ruins, more like memories. The edges of the buildings were sharp, as if they had just been abandoned, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wood, mildew, and something else. Something darker. I blinked, trying to clear the fog in my mind. What had happened? How did I turned in a slow circle, taking in the surroundings, and then I saw it. The water. It had risen, no longer confined to the ruins, but creeping over the land, swirling in pools like dark mirrors, reflecting the pale sky. I could see faces in the ripples. Faces I didn't recognize, but they were familiar in some way. Familiar because they looked wrong, as though they had been pulled from something ancient, something lost. And the shadows. They were moving again. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into one of the pools. The figures were there, shadows that flickered in and out of existence, drifting through the water like specters. Some of them were human-shaped, but others were twisted, monstrous things, with arms too long and faces too still. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their eyes clearly. The temperature dropped, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep warm, but the cold wasn't the kind that could be chased away by any physical warmth. It felt deeper, colder than the water, as if it was seeping into my soul. A sudden rustle caught my attention, a movement in the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just more shadows, just more shifting, distorted shapes that seemed to stretch and distort when I wasn't looking directly at them. I was alone, I realized. But I wasn't. You're not alone. The voice again. Soft, almost soothing, but there was something unsettling about the way it echoed through the silence. It wasn't coming from any one place, but it was everywhere. Inside me, around me, behind me, in front of me. You're never alone here. I felt a tremor of fear pulse through me. I had to find the source of the voice. I had to understand. I stepped forward cautiously, the earth beneath my boots soft and unyielding, almost as if the land was alive, reacting to my every movement. The wind had died down, but the air was thick with tension, pressing against my chest with every breath. I felt as though I was walking through a dream or a nightmare, where every step I took only led me deeper into the darkness. The houses now loomed larger, towering over me, their broken windows like empty eyes watching my every move. I tried not to look at the water, but it was impossible. The faces were there again, rising and falling, moving like they were alive, like they were trying to tell me something. One face stood out, pale, haunting, its features barely recognizable beneath the ripples. It seemed to stare at me, its eyes dark and endless. It was the face of a man, but something about it was wrong. He wasn't human anymore. The features had twisted, bent out of shape, as though the water itself had claimed him and molded him into something else. I felt my breath catch in my throat. That face. The man's mouth moved, though there was no sound. His lips formed words that I couldn't hear, and yet somehow I understood. They all drown here. I staggered back, heart racing, my hands shaking. No, that couldn't be true. This village had been abandoned for years. It had been flooded. People had left. They left. But you didn't leave. I spun around, the voice now louder, closer. A dark figure stood behind me, just outside the reach of the dim light. It was tall, its shape indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. The air grew thick around it, the temperature plummeting again as if it was absorbing all warmth and light. The shadows seemed to bend toward it, and the darkness became alive, twisting and writhing. I froze. The figure moved toward me, and I could feel its power, its intent. I couldn't see its face, but I could sense its eyes that saw everything, that knew everything about me. The voice, though not speaking aloud, was inside my mind now, wrapping around my thoughts. You have to know what happened. I swallowed, my throat dry. I didn't know what was real anymore. Everything felt distorted, out of place. The village, the figures in the water, the shadows, none of it made sense. But I knew one thing. This place, it wasn't just a village. It was something else. Something old. Something that had lived long before I arrived and would remain long after I left. You can't leave. The words wrapped themselves around me, and I could feel the pull. It wasn't a physical force, but something much deeper. The earth, the water, the air, all of it was calling me, urging me to stay. I had to get out. I had to break free from whatever hold this place had on me. But when I turned to run, the path was gone. The village had shifted. The houses had closed in. The shadows were all around me now, stretching and twisting, their forms indistinguishable. I was trapped. I was never meant to leave. And the village was waiting for me to become part of it. The water began to rise again. The voices swelled around me, and the darkness grew deeper. I was still here, and I always would be. The air was suffocating now, thick with an unnatural stillness. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the damp earth beneath me. The shadows were closing in. They weren't just moving anymore, they were shifting, folding in on themselves like living things, like the very fabric of the village had become alive. The buildings seemed to lean toward me, as if they were eager to consume me, to pull me into their decaying embrace. I could hear the whispers again. They were louder this time, more distinct. They were words, but not in any language I recognized. The syllables twisted in the air, curling around my head like tendrils. The voices were soft, haunting, and seemed to speak to me from every direction. I couldn't make out the meaning, but I felt them. They were all around me, inside me. I was drowning in their sound. You don't belong here. The voice, that voice, was clearer now. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was a presence. A being. And it was speaking directly to me, to the very core of my existence. I turned, but the figure was gone. The one that had watched me, that had called to me. I could still feel it, though, its gaze, its weight, pressing down on me like a physical force. I wasn't alone. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place by something that wasn't just fear. It was as if the land itself had a hold on me, as if every inch of soil, every breath of air was conspiring to keep me here. I forced my legs to move, my body to obey, but each step felt more futile than the last. Then I saw them again, the faces. They were in the water, in the shadows, in the very air around me. They were waiting, watching. Some were familiar. Others were not. But all of them shared one thing in common: they were dead. Their eyes, hollow and unseeing, stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Their faces were twisted, as if the water had claimed them and distorted them into something unrecognizable. "We died here," one whispered, its voice nothing more than a breath in the wind. "We never left." The words echoed in my ears, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The weight of their gaze intensified, as though they were pulling me toward them, urging me to join them in the depths of the water, to become one of them. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was clouded, spinning in a haze of confusion and terror. The village had become a prison, a trap, a place where the living were swallowed by the dead. "You will stay with us." The voice, now unmistakably cold and commanding, was no longer a whisper. It was a statement of fact, an inevitability. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the water's surface, and the instant I touched it, everything changed. The air grew colder. The water surged upward, engulfing my hand, and I was pulled forward, drawn into the depths. My heart raced, but my body couldn't resist. The village was consuming me. I fought, desperate to break free, but the water closed around me like a vice, its cold fingers wrapping around my body, pulling me down, down into the dark. And then, something shifted. I broke through the surface, gasping for air, but the village was gone. The houses, the shadows, the faces, all of it had vanished. I was standing in a different place now, a place that felt familiar but wrong. The ground was dry, cracked, and barren, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. The village had never existed, I thought, but that thought felt strange, as if it was a lie. "You're here now," the voice said again, its tone softer, almost pitying. And suddenly, I realized. The village, the water, the faces, they were all me. They were part of me, a part of my mind that I couldn't escape, no matter how far I ran. The ghosts of the drowned village weren't some ancient curse, some forgotten tragedy. They were fragments of my own past, my own fears, my own guilt. "You will never leave," the voice whispered once more, its words wrapping around me like chains. "Not unless you understand." The world around me twisted again, the barren ground shifting into something darker, deeper. The faces were back, rising from the earth, their eyes locked onto mine. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't. Their gaze held me in place, anchored me to this nightmare. And then I saw it, the thing that had been following me, lurking in the shadows all along. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, standing just out of my reach. I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was something more. Something ancient. "Understand." The voice grew louder, its tone pressing against my skull. "This place is you. This is where you belong. This is your prison." I took a step back, my mind reeling. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't trapped here. I wasn't. You are. The figure moved, and with it came the oppressive weight of the village. The shadows, the water, the faces, they all rushed back toward me, closing in, wrapping around me, suffocating me in their cold embrace. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it stopped. The air cleared. The shadows retreated. The voices faded into silence. But I knew one thing for certain. I was never meant to leave. And neither were they. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The village was gone, replaced by a barren, desolate landscape that stretched out endlessly before me. There were no more faces, no more whispers, only the quiet hum of something I couldn't quite place. But I knew they were still there. I could feel them, just beneath the surface of reality, like ghosts trapped in the space between moments. The air was thick with the weight of their presence, pressing against my skin, my mind. They were watching, waiting for me to understand. I took a step forward, though every part of me screamed to turn back. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, as though it might swallow me whole if I took another step. But the voice, their voice, was still echoing in my mind, pulling me forward. Understand. It was the same voice, but it was no longer cold and commanding. It was softer now, almost pleading. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the earth, from the air, from the very fabric of the world itself. You have to understand. I stumbled, my legs unsteady, as if the ground had begun to shift beneath me. The landscape was changing, warping around me. The sky above twisted in unnatural patterns, and the wind grew still, the air heavy with something I couldn't describe. The shadows in the distance seemed to stretch and bend, taking on forms that were not quite human. It was then that I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the distance, standing motionless at the edge of what once had been the village square. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch and twist as though they were made of shadows. Its face was hidden, obscured by a hood or perhaps something worse, something that made the air around it seem colder, more suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. "You're here," the voice said again, its tone filled with sorrow. "And now you see. You are part of it. This is your truth." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt as though the very earth beneath me was holding me in place, as though the land itself was a prison and I was its unwilling inmate. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step seemed to pull the very essence of the world toward it, bending reality with its presence. I could feel its gaze now, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the shadows, were more figures, dozens, hundreds. They were like phantoms, wisps of smoke and shadow, their faces twisted in silent screams. Some were human, but many were not. They were things that couldn't be named, creatures born from the depths of nightmare. I had no words, no thoughts. My mind was unraveling, spinning faster and faster until it was nothing more than a tangled mess of fear and confusion. I had to escape. I had to get away. But as I tried to move, I realized the truth. There was nowhere to run. The ground beneath my feet had become the village square. The trees around me were the same twisted, gnarled shapes I had seen before. The shadows were the same, stretching and bending in ways that were not natural. I was trapped. You can't leave, the voice whispered, its tone now hollow and resigned. This is where you belong. I closed my eyes, desperate to escape the sight of the figures, but when I opened them again, I was no longer in the barren landscape. I was back in the village. But it wasn't the village I had seen before. This was different. The buildings were whole, standing tall and unbroken, as if time itself had turned backward. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, but there was something more. Something wrong. The people were here. I saw them standing in the streets, moving silently, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger I couldn't understand. Their faces were familiar, people I knew, people I had lost. They were the ones who had drowned, who had died when the village was flooded. But they were not dead anymore. They were alive. They were watching me, waiting for me to join them. You've always been one of us, a voice said behind me, familiar and cold. I turned, and there she was, Lena. Her face, once kind and warm, was now cold and lifeless. Her eyes were empty, hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. You should have known, she whispered, her voice low and mournful. We never left. We've always been here. I stumbled back, my body shaking uncontrollably. The world around me was spinning, warping, twisting into something I couldn't grasp. The village was changing, just like before, but now it was worse. It was as though reality itself was disintegrating before my eyes, crumbling into nothingness. And then, I understood. The village had never been a place. It had never been a memory. It was a state. A place between life and death, between waking and sleeping, between what was real and what was imagined. I was never meant to leave. None of us were. You're part of us now, Lena's voice echoed in my mind. And you'll never escape. I tried to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. The shadows closed in around me, the figures reaching out with long, clawed hands, their fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me closer. And then, I knew. I was one of them now. Forever. I was lost. We all were. And the village would never let us go. It started with a sound. A whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the creaking of the old house settling as the night grew colder. But there was something about it. Something wrong. I should have ignored it. I should have written it off as my imagination, the result of the late hour and the stillness of the house. But I couldn't. It lingered in my mind, curling around my thoughts like a shadow. A whisper, like a voice, carried across the darkness, too clear to be the wind. I was alone in the house, my usual companions nothing more than the flickering light of a solitary lamp and the soft ticking of an old clock. But the house, well, it was never entirely silent. Not with the house's strange history. The previous owners had never stayed for long, and some whispered they left because the place was cursed. I never believed it. But that night, that whisper, it made me question everything. The voice was soft, barely audible, like a breath just beyond reach. I tried to focus, straining my ears to catch the words, but they were elusive. Come closer. The whisper was barely there, but it seemed to pull at me like an invisible force drawing me toward the source. I froze. I didn't move. My heart raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It didn't feel like a simple sound. It felt alive, like it was part of me, part of this house, a presence that had been waiting, patient and hungry. And it wanted something from me. I stood still for a moment, not daring to breathe. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the house was just old, that the wind had played tricks on me. But something in the back of my mind told me this was no trick. Something was wrong. The air grew colder, and the whisper grew louder. This time, I could almost hear it clearly. It's too late. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with fear. It felt like a death sentence, an unspoken truth that I wasn't ready to face. I moved slowly toward the source of the voice, my steps careful, but my curiosity driving me forward. The house was dark, the shadows thick, and the silence seemed oppressive now. Every corner held something I couldn't see. Every step I took, I felt watched, as if the walls themselves were breathing with me. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door at the end of the corridor, the one that had always been locked, was now ajar. I didn't remember opening it. I couldn't have. It had always been locked. But now, the crack in the door seemed to beckon me. I wanted to turn away. I should have turned away. But the whisper, now louder, seemed to come from the room beyond. You must see. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I approached the door, pushing it open just a little more. Inside, the room was colder than the rest of the house, and the air was thick, saturated with a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. The room looked normal. A simple bedroom, furnished with an old bed, a nightstand, and a faded rug on the floor. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. But there was something in the air, something wrong. It wasn't the room itself, it was me. Something was happening to me. I had the distinct feeling that something had changed, that I had crossed a line I could never return from. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the window, was a figure. A shape in the darkness, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, its edges blurred like smoke. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized that it wasn't a shadow. It was a person. At first, I thought it was someone standing there, maybe another figure who had entered the room. But no! This wasn't a person. This thing, this creature, stood unnaturally still, its form stretched and elongated, its features indistinct. I could feel its presence pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The whisper came again, this time from within my own head. You shouldn't have come. You're already too late. I backed away, my breath shallow and rapid, but my legs refused to obey me. I couldn't move. The thing in the corner began to sway, its shape shifting in unnatural ways. And then I saw it, the face. Or, at least, what was left of it. It was a mask of skin and bone, pulled taut over a hollow, gaping void where eyes should have been. The mouth was open, but no sound came from it, only that whisper, still pushing into my mind, like a thought I couldn't escape. The end is near. And then, I understood. This wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a specter. It was death itself, standing before me, whispering my fate. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, and the thing in the corner stepped closer, its cold presence wrapping around me like chains. I knew then that this wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. And I had already accepted. The room closed in on me. The air was thick with the weight of something unspoken, something ancient. Every corner felt like it was leaning in, waiting to swallow me whole. I was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming pull of the creature in the corner. Its presence was suffocating, wrapping around me like an invisible hand, tightening, and I couldn't escape. The whispering wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a feeling. I could feel it in my chest, pressing down with each breath, like the weight of the world itself was bearing down on me. The words it whispered, no, the thoughts it planted, weren't mine, and yet they felt like they were tearing through my mind, sinking into the deepest part of me. You shouldn't have come here, the voice said, now louder, closer. It's already too late for you. My heart pounded in my ears, but still, I couldn't move. The thing in the corner shifted again, its form undulating, like the very air around it was bending. It was no longer a human shape, if it ever had been. Its outline blurred, its edges swirling and fading in and out of focus, as if reality itself was struggling to keep it contained. I felt the cold seep deeper, and I swore I could hear the faint sound of my own heartbeat, thumping harder, faster, as the darkness around me seemed to pulse. Suddenly, the thing in the corner moved. It didn't walk, no, it was more like a twisting of the air itself. One moment, it was there, in the corner, and the next, it was at the foot of the bed, a shifting silhouette that felt more like a part of the room than something alive. I felt my skin crawl, every muscle in my body begging me to run, but I couldn't make myself move. You can't escape, it whispered, its voice now inside my mind. It wasn't a voice in my ears, but in my thoughts, like it was trying to become me. You are already here. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything. My body had betrayed me, paralyzed by terror. The whisper, that unearthly voice, was wrapping around me, tightening its grip on my very thoughts. I wanted to cry out, to run, to do anything to make it stop. But the words wouldn't come. The thing's presence was everywhere now, consuming the room, consuming me. The walls seemed to stretch and twist in response to its power. It was as if the room itself was breathing with it, alive, aware, waiting. You are mine, it whispered again, and this time it felt like it touched me. Cold, icy fingers brushed across my skin, sending shivers down my spine, freezing my very soul. And then, in the darkness of my mind, a sudden image flashed, an image of a face. A face I recognized. It was a face from the past, someone I had known, someone I had lost. But the face was distorted, stretched, its eyes hollow, its skin pale and cracked. It was a dead face, a face from a grave, but it spoke to me. Don't fight it, the voice from the face said. We all end up here eventually. The cold grew sharper, more intense, like I was standing in the heart of a frozen wasteland, unable to move, unable to escape. The whisper became louder, its words more insistent. You're not getting out. I could hear it now, feel it, as though the very air was thick with the words. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a force that pressed in on all sides, that dug into my very mind. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't leave me. It wasn't until I heard the door creak open behind me that I was able to snap out of my stupor. My heart nearly leaped from my chest as I turned toward the sound, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The whispering stopped abruptly, but the weight of it, the feeling of being watched, didn't disappear. In the doorway stood a figure, a man, no, a shadow, shrouded in darkness, his face indistinguishable. His form was almost human, but the longer I stared at him, the more he seemed to shimmer, like his shape wasn't entirely real. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. You shouldn't have listened, the voice inside my mind said again. This time, it wasn't the creature. It was coming from him. But now, you can't stop it. He raised his hand slowly, and I felt the temperature drop even further, the cold now seeping into my bones. I tried to step back, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my body unwilling to cooperate. No one escapes once they hear the whisper, he said softly, his voice low, as though he had all the time in the world. Not even you. I tried to scream, but again, the sound died in my throat. My mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. And as I stood there, frozen in place, the figure in the doorway reached out, his hand inches from my face, and I could feel the whisper in the air, the chill of death creeping closer. It was too late. I could feel the presence of the figure like a weight on my chest, the air growing thicker with each passing second. His hand, now mere inches from my face, seemed to stretch impossibly longer, his fingers twisted, unnatural. Every part of him was a distortion, a nightmare taking shape in the dim light of the room. And yet, I couldn't look away. My mind screamed for me to run, to fight, to do something, but my body betrayed me. I was rooted to the spot, helpless. You thought you could escape, didn't you? The figure's voice was like the sound of ice breaking under the pressure of a storm. Cold, sharp, unrelenting. You thought this was just a game, but it's already too late. The whisper returned then, soft at first, like a breath against the back of my neck, and then louder, more insistent. You are already part of this. You cannot run from what you've heard. The words sliced through my mind, filling every corner of it, pushing aside everything else until I could think of nothing but the whisper. It was a sound that no one should ever hear, a noise that crept under your skin and burrowed into your bones. A promise of something far worse than death. It wasn't just a voice, it was something else, an entity, something older, far older than the room itself, far older than I could understand. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes at all, flickered. They were hollow, empty, yet filled with something I couldn't comprehend. They stared at me, but not with malice, not with anger, but with a sense of inevitability. I felt as if I were staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back. You think you can scream? You think you can fight it off? He said, his voice low and mocking. You have already heard the whisper. And now, there is no escape from what follows. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. There was nothing left. Nothing but the cold and the crushing weight of the silence that followed his words. The room had become too quiet, unnaturally still, as if even time had frozen in fear of what was coming. And then, I noticed it, the air was wrong. The walls seemed to ripple, as if the space around me were no longer real, no longer solid. It wasn't the room itself that had changed. It was me. I was becoming part of it. Part of the whisper. The figure moved then, his form flickering like a flame in the wind. He leaned closer, and his voice dropped to a whisper, that same damnable whisper that had followed me into this nightmare. I know your name. I know your every fear, your every secret. This, he paused, his eyes widening with a dark, twisted amusement. This is where it all ends. The cold rushed back with a vengeance, the temperature in the room dropping so sharply that I could see my breath in front of me. I felt my pulse quicken, a sharp panic rising in my chest. It was impossible to breathe, the air too thick. My heart hammered in my ears. You don't understand, I gasped, fighting for control. This can't be real. None of this, none of you. The figure didn't respond at first. Instead, he He seemed to smile, or rather, his face contorted into something that resembled a smile. The skin around his lips stretched too wide, revealing sharp, pointed teeth that gleamed in the darkness. He took another step forward, the floor creaking beneath him as if it were alive. "You were warned," he murmured, as his hand hovered just above my face. His fingers were too long, too pale, and I could feel the air around them grow heavier, colder. "But you didn't listen." The whisper became a scream. A wailed agony that filled my skull, pounding against my brain until it was all I could hear, all I could think about. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air that would not come. The room spun around me, the walls seeming to close in, and I knew, with a terrible certainty, that I was slipping away. I could feel it now, the presence. The weight of something ancient, watching from the corners of my mind. It wasn't just a figure in front of me. No. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for me, for this moment, to bring me into its fold. It was something that didn't need to show itself, didn't need to reveal its form. It simply was, and I was its prey. I've heard the whispers before, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. I thought it was just a dream, a delusion. But now I know. The figure crouched in front of me, his face inches from mine. He reached out, fingers brushing my cheek. His touch was cold, deathly cold, and I couldn't move. My body felt like stone, like I was sinking into the ground itself, buried in the weight of it all. The whisper grew louder, until it consumed every thought, every ounce of my being. "There's no going back," he said, his voice echoing in my skull. "You've already crossed the line." And then, everything went dark. I woke up, but not the way I had hoped. The room was empty, silent. The figure, that haunting presence, was gone. My head felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on it. The darkness lingered, but I could feel the faintest pulse of light creeping in from somewhere, not quite sunlight, more like the remnants of it. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, or when. Had I really passed out? Had I died? But the worst part was the silence. It was unnatural. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. It felt like the very air had been sucked out, leaving me in some hollow, forgotten place where no one would ever find me. I tried to sit up, but my body screamed in protest. The weight of my limbs felt foreign, too heavy, as if they were made of something far denser than flesh. My skin tingled. There was a faint vibration, deep inside my chest, like something inside me was beginning to shift, to wake. Then I heard it again. A whisper. It was soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. But as it came closer, it grew clearer, almost like words that were meant for me alone. "Don't fight it." The voice seemed to press against my eardrums, as if trying to break through the very fabric of reality. You knew what would happen when you listened. You knew you couldn't run. I froze. It wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head. The whisper curled around my thoughts, weaving them into something dark, something twisted. It was everywhere. I could feel it, crawling through the walls, the air, the very ground beneath me. "You've heard the death that waits for you, and now it comes." The words made my stomach twist. I didn't know if they were real. Was I hallucinating? Was I dreaming? But no, there was no dreamlike quality to it. No, this felt all too real. This felt like something I couldn't wake up from. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, as if reaching out for me. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the darkness only grew deeper, more suffocating. And there, in the depths, I saw something, just a flicker at first, but unmistakable. A figure. Tall, motionless. "You cannot escape what you have awakened," it said, its voice not quite the whisper anymore, but something more solid, more alive. "You've heard the truth, now it's time to listen." I stood, or at least I tried to. My legs shook beneath me, weak and unsteady, but I made it to my feet. Every step felt like wading through thick mud, each movement dragging me deeper into the room, deeper into the presence that now hung heavy around me. The room wasn't familiar anymore. It had changed. The walls were covered in an unfamiliar, greasy sheen. The ceiling seemed too low, the air too thick. There were no windows, no escape. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. Where am I? "It doesn't matter where you are," the whisper echoed through the room. "The place you thought you knew, it was never real. Nothing here is real anymore." I spun around, my eyes frantic, searching for something to hold on to. There were no doors, no windows, no way out. The whispering, no, it was more than that now. It was a command. A demand. I could hear it in the walls, in the floor, under my skin. It was coming for me. And then it shifted. The sound of footsteps, light but deliberate, echoed through the stillness of the room. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I wasn't alone. "It's time for you to listen to me," the voice, no, the presence, said again. The whisper doesn't stop. It never stops. I spun around, my breath quickening. The figure in the corner moved, sliding into the shadows, but I could still feel its gaze upon me, heavy, cold, penetrating. My body was shaking uncontrollably now, every muscle screaming to flee, but where? There was nowhere to run. The figure's silhouette became clearer, more defined, and suddenly I could hear it, the unmistakable sound of its breath. Deep, raspy, almost like a growl. "You shouldn't have listened," it whispered, right in my ear, a chilling breath against my neck. I gasped and stumbled backward, only to collide with the cold, slick wall. My hands went to my face, trying to shield myself from the impossible, from the thing that had found me. But nothing could stop it. Nothing could stop him. "You will remember me," it said, its voice low and drawn out. "Every step you take, every breath you draw will remind you of the whisper, until it consumes you." I pressed my hands to my ears, but it was useless. The whisper was already inside, clawing at the very heart of my mind. "You can't stop it," the voice hissed. "You can never stop it." The air grew colder, and for the first time, I felt it, my heartbeat, slow and deliberate, as if it were a ticking clock counting down to something. My body shook, my mind was spinning, but in that moment, I knew one thing: I had to get out. I had to escape. But the room had no doors, no windows, no way out. The only thing left was the whisper, and it was closing in on me, piece by piece. I ran, but where? The room I had found myself in was a prison, the walls closing in with every desperate step I took. The cold sweat that had soaked through my clothes turned into a chill that burrowed deep inside me, numbing my limbs. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to escape. The thing, the presence, it was right behind me. I could feel it, its breath heavy in my ears, its footsteps in sync with my frantic pace. The room twisted around me as I ran, the space bending like it was made of soft clay, warping with every step. One moment, I was running down a narrow corridor, and the next, I was stumbling through a room that seemed far too large for the space I'd been in moments before. The light flickered, casting strange shadows across the floor, shadows that seemed to move on their own, stretching toward me like hands reaching from the darkness. The whisper came again, sharp and insistent. "You can't run away from me." I skidded to a halt, my heart pounding in my chest. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I spun, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, of something dead. The walls were slick with a strange, sticky substance that glistened faintly under the dim light. The floor was uneven, as though the very foundation of the place was rotting away beneath me. And then, the figure. It stood there, its form more solid now, its presence undeniable. The shadows that clung to it seemed to bend the light, twisting it into impossible shapes. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting nothing but emptiness. "You're mine now," the voice growled, this time not in a whisper, but a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the space, vibrating the air around me. "You called me, and now you will answer." I felt the words press down on my chest, heavy and suffocating, like chains wrapping around my ribs. My mind scrambled for an escape, but there was nothing. No doors. No windows. No escape. It was just it, and me. Alone in this dark, endless place. I took a step back, my hands trembling as they pressed against the wall. The surface was warm, as though the very walls were alive, pulsing with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The whisper returned, colder this time. "You know me," it said, its voice almost tender, as if it were speaking directly to my soul. "You knew me long before this night. You've been waiting for me." The words hit me like a slap, sending a jolt through my body. Waiting? For it? I didn't understand. I didn't remember. "It's been waiting, too," the voice murmured, this time coming from somewhere deep within my own mind. "Waiting for you to listen." My knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, my mind reeling. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step sending a pulse of dread through the air. My vision blurred, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. "You can't escape what's inside you," it whispered. "You never could." The words felt like a dagger to my chest, piercing deep into the parts of me that I didn't want to acknowledge. Memories, flickers of something, began to surface. A life I had long forgotten. Faces I hadn't seen in years. All of them dead. "You've always known," the voice taunted. "The whispers have always been there, guiding you." I closed my eyes, pressing my hands to my ears, but it didn't matter. The voice was inside my head now, its words seeping into my every thought, every breath. My hands shook violently, my pulse thundering in my temples. And then, I saw it. The thing. Its face was twisted. No, not a face. Not truly. It was something much older, something ancient. A grotesque mask of what had once been human, but had long since rotted away into something unrecognizable. Its eyes, hollow and empty, stared down at me with an intensity that seemed to cut through everything. Through time. Through memory. "You will join them," the voice said. "Join the ones who called me before you. Join them in the darkness." It stepped closer. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, as though it too were trapped by the thing before me. My throat tightened, and I could taste the bitter, metallic tang of fear rising in the back of my mouth. The thing reached out, its long, skeletal hand hovering just inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating from it, colder than any ice, colder than death itself. I could feel its fingers, sharp as knives, about to touch me. And then, a scream tore from my lips, my own, and yet not entirely my own. A scream that echoed through the vast, endless nothing around us. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just the thing in front of me. It was the whisper. It was everything. The fear, the darkness, the pull of the grave, the inevitable. It was all the same. "It's too late," the whisper said, its voice now a maddening, deafening crescendo. "You're already mine." The hand reached out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a matter of my eyes catching movement out of the corner of their vision or hearing the crunch of leaves in the distance. It was something deeper, a presence, one that seemed to linger just behind me. It was an unsettling sensation, but I pressed on. The path before me, a narrow, winding trail leading through an overgrown town, felt strangely familiar. Every step I took felt like it belonged to someone else, as though I had walked this route 1,000 times before, though I was certain it was the first time. The ground beneath my feet was soft, uneven, almost as if the earth itself was hesitant to support me. I had never been to this town, and yet, as I wandered deeper, every detail about it felt eerily known. The crooked buildings, their decaying facades barely holding together, the half-broken windows that stared out like empty eyes, and the air, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, all whispered to me of a forgotten past. A place long abandoned, yet still very much alive in its silence. I reached a clearing where the ruins of an old house stood. A feeling of dread clung to the air, and something in the pit of my stomach twisted. I could see the faint remnants of what once was a swing set now buried in vines, a rusted gate that hadn't been opened in years. Yet, there was something unnatural about the stillness. Even the birds had stopped singing, as though waiting for something. The wind shifted, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard it, the faintest whisper. It was too quiet to make out any words, but it felt like it was coming from all around me, the sound barely more than a breeze passing through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around, to leave. A low creak echoed through the air, followed by the soft scuff of footsteps. I was no longer alone. I wanted to run, to escape this place that seemed to reach out to me, but my feet wouldn't move. They were rooted to the ground, and I stood there, caught in the grip of something larger than myself. My breath hitched, and I could feel my pulse racing in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a figment of my imagination. But the longer I stood there, the more certain I became something was wrong with this town. Something ancient, something buried beneath the weight of time, was calling me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The figure was obscured in shadow, its features hidden. My heart stopped. I wasn't alone. It was waiting for me. I had known, deep down, that I wasn't meant to be here. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, now clearly distinguishable as words. But the words didn't make sense, not in any language I knew. They felt like fragments of something ancient, memories of a past long forgotten. Without thinking, I stepped back. My foot caught on the uneven ground, and I stumbled forward. The figure in the distance didn't move, it simply watched, the silence stretching longer and longer between us. And then, a voice, not from the figure, but from inside my own mind, whispered, "Leave, before it's too late." I didn't move. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat deafening in the suffocating silence. The voice echoed in my head, each word more urgent than the last. Leave, before it's too late. But I couldn't bring myself to obey. My feet felt as though they were glued to the ground, and no matter how hard I tried to look away, I couldn't tear my eyes from that figure. It stood there, still and unmoving, like a part of the darkness itself. Its form was indistinct, a shadow that melted into the night, but I could sense its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against me. The longer I stared, the more my mind began to twist. I could feel something tugging at my memories, something I had buried deep within myself. An emotion I couldn't name, but one that clung to me like a second skin. Suddenly, the wind picked up, sending a chill through the air. It carried with it an odd, rancid scent, a mixture of damp earth and something rotting, decayed. My stomach lurched, and for a brief moment, I thought I might vomit. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, and I took an involuntary step back. The figure remained motionless, but I could sense a shift in the air. Something had changed. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears like a rising tide, becoming clearer now. "You know why you're here," the voice hissed. It wasn't the same voice I had heard before. This was something darker, colder, older. The words didn't make sense, but I understood them all the same. "You remember," it said. I shuddered. What do I remember? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, as though invisible hands were squeezing the air from my lungs. The figure finally stirred. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a slow, deliberate turn of the head. The action was so unnatural, so deliberate in its slowness, that it sent a jolt of terror through me. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and twist, as if the very darkness was shifting. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something, a face, pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and wide. But just as quickly, it disappeared, melting back into the shadows. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath shallow. Panic clawed at my insides, but I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, and every instinct I had told me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure that now seemed to be coming closer. Each step it took was measured, its presence a growing force, enveloping the space around me. I wanted to shout, to beg it to stop, but my voice caught in my throat, leaving me paralyzed. A single, cold tear slid down my cheek as I realized I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the figure that was trapping me, it was the town itself, the path I was on. I had walked into something I couldn't understand, something I wasn't meant to confront. And then, just as the figure drew near, it stopped. The air around me grew thick with tension, and the whispers faded to a low hum, like the murmur of a distant crowd. "You're too late," the voice whispered again, but this time there was a finality in its tone. The figure lifted its hand slowly, pointing toward the decaying house behind me. I turned, half expecting to see nothing, but the house was different now. What had once been a broken, crumbling structure was now vibrant, alive with a strange, eerie energy. The windows, though cracked and clouded, glowed with a faint light, a sickly, greenish hue that seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. The front door creaked open, but no wind had blown it. It opened as though invited, as though beckoning me to step inside. For a moment, everything inside me screamed to run. But I didn't. Something, deep within me, compelled me to move toward the door, to cross the threshold into the unknown. As I took that first step, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and the figure, still shrouded in darkness, remained watching, its eyes locked onto me, waiting. The door closed behind me with a hollow thud, and I was swallowed by the silence. The only sound now was the beating of my heart, louder and faster than before. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing me into the suffocating silence of the house. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay, but it was also different. There was an unnatural chill that seemed to cling to the walls, wrapping around me like a cold hand, pulling at my very skin. I couldn't breathe freely. My chest felt tight, as if something was pressing against it from the inside. Every small noise, every creak of the floorboards under my feet, sounded unnaturally loud, echoing through the hollow space like the footsteps of something unseen, following just out of view. I stood still for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. The darkness seemed to stretch in every direction. The dim light from the cracked windows barely illuminated anything, just faint shapes and shadows that twisted and shifted in ways that defied reason. I could barely make out the walls, which appeared warped, as if the house itself had grown twisted over time. There was no sign of life here. Yet, I felt an unmistakable presence, something ancient, something watching, waiting. I took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath me. My eyes were drawn to a hallway at the end of the room, where the shadows gathered more densely. Something whispered there, something that wasn't quite human. The whispers I had heard outside were now inside my head, louder, clearer, but still distorted. They murmured in strange, unintelligible words, but I could feel their meaning deep in my chest. They were calling me. I forced myself to move, even as every instinct screamed at me to leave, to escape. But I couldn't. My feet were moving before I even realized it, drawn to the hallway, to the dark space beyond. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift with each step I took, as though the house itself was breathing with me. The hallway was narrow, its walls closing in around me, the ceiling low and oppressive. I could feel the temperature dropping, the cold seeping into my bones. A shiver ran through me as I walked further, my fingers brushing against the peeling wallpaper. The surface felt slick and damp, as though the house itself was sweating. At the end of the hallway was a door. Unlike the others I had seen, this one seemed normal. It was solid, unremarkable, its wood untouched by the rot that plagued the rest of the house. But as I approached, I noticed something strange, a faint, red stain on the floor beneath the door. I knelt to examine it, my breath coming shallow and uneven. It was fresh, still wet to the touch, and my mind couldn't make sense of it. What is this? The whispers grew louder as I stood, a cacophony of voices layered on top of each other, crying out in pain and desperation. You shouldn't have come, one of them hissed. It's already too late. I recoiled, stepping back. The door creaked open slowly, as if it had been waiting for me to make the first move. The darkness beyond it felt like a living thing, something that reached out to pull me in. I hesitated for a moment, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening, but then I couldn't resist. I stepped over the threshold. Inside, the room was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with dust and decay. But there, in the far corner, I saw a shape, a figure standing motionless, bathed in a faint, sickly light. The light was coming from somewhere I couldn't see, but it was enough to reveal the figure's outline. It was a woman, her long, dark hair tangled and matted against her pale skin. She was dressed in tattered clothing, her eyes hollow and empty. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart stopped. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was the same voice that had whispered to me before, the same voice that had warned me. But it couldn't be her. I tried to move closer, my legs trembling, my breath shallow. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking in the silence. But before I could get an answer, the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend, the floor beneath me groaning as though the entire house was alive, twisting and contorting with a malevolent energy. The woman in the corner dissolved into the shadows, her form melting away like smoke in the air. And then, the real horror began. A soft, hissing sound filled the room, followed by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my bones. I turned, my eyes desperately searching the room, but there was nothing. The whispers had turned into a roar in my mind, deafening me, drowning me in a sea of madness. My body was frozen in place, unable to react, unable to run. It was as though the house itself was closing in around me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its dark heart. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The growls, the whispers, all of it disappeared. I stood there, gasping for air, disoriented, my head spinning. But it was too late. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the silence. And when I turned, I saw her again. The woman was closer now, her face twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes wide with madness. She reached out, her hand trembling, fingers elongated and claw-like, and whispered, "You've already seen it." The world around me began to tilt, the walls collapsing, the floor splitting. And in the blackness, I felt the weight of something ancient, something far worse than I could comprehend, closing in around me. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, but no matter how fast I moved, the house, the darkness, was always right behind me. I could feel the oppressive weight of the house pressing in on me as I sprinted through the corridors, my breath ragged and shallow. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I feared the sound alone would bring the walls crashing down around me. But there was something else, something darker lurking in the corners of my mind, just out of reach, a shadow of thought I couldn't fully grasp. The woman's face, her twisted grin, and the madness in her eyes were burned into my mind. I couldn't escape her, couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching me, following me, whispering to me from the dark corners of the house. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I was sure I'd see her again, but each time, the hallway was empty. The walls around me seemed to warp with every step I took. The familiar creaks of the floorboards had turned into groaning wails, as though the very house was alive, trying to swallow me whole. The once distant whispers now echoed in my skull, louder, more insistent. I couldn't separate them from my own thoughts anymore. They were a part of me. "Come back," one voice whispered, low and sweet. "No, don't leave me," another begged. The walls began to close in, the hallway stretching and distorting like a tunnel that wouldn't end. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if I was breathing in something far worse than dust or mold, something toxic, ancient, and foul. I staggered forward, trying to force my legs to move faster, but it was as if the very ground beneath me was slowing my steps. My thoughts began to fragment, unraveling like thread from an old, worn tapestry. How long had I been running? Minutes? Hours? Or had I been standing still all along, trapped in a never-ending nightmare? I stumbled into a room. No, it wasn't a room at all. There was no window, no door. Just darkness. A vast, empty void that stretched endlessly in all directions. The floor beneath my feet was uneven, like stepping on the surface of water. My eyes were wide, my vision blurred, but I could still feel the weight of the shadows pressing in around me. The whispers had stopped, and in their place, a silence filled the space, an eerie, suffocating silence that buzzed in my ears. Then, from the void, came a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. The scraping of metal against stone, a long, drawn-out screech, followed by a sickening thud. Something was coming for me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a presence, something cold and malevolent, creeping closer. My heart seized in my chest. I backed away, my feet stumbling against the uneven floor, my mind desperately searching for a way out, any escape. But the room seemed to stretch on, growing larger and darker with every step. Then, from the darkness, a shape appeared, a shadow, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, jerking and twitching as if controlled by some unseen force. The figure moved toward me, its movement unnatural, like it was being dragged through the air rather than walking. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank, featureless mask, an empty void where eyes should have been. I gasped, the air catching in my throat. The thing reached out, its hand an elongated, gnarled appendage, reaching for me with a speed that I couldn't follow. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in place by a force stronger than fear itself. It was upon me now, its cold, unnatural presence suffocating the air, pressing down on my chest like 1,000 pounds. The hand hovered just inches from my face, its fingers curled into claws, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder, sharper. I could see my breath now, swirling in front of me like mist, but the thing's hand didn't touch me. It hovered there, its cold fingers just brushing against my skin, sending an icy chill through my veins. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then, from behind the mask, came the voice, a voice I recognized, though I had no idea where it came from. "You've seen the truth," it rasped, its voice like gravel scraping against bone. "It's too late. You can't escape now." I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel my sanity slipping away, unraveling like a thread being pulled from a fraying garment. The world around me began to warp, the shadows growing deeper, the air growing thicker. My mind was swimming, drowning in the darkness. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was empty again, the shadows receding, the silence overwhelming. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. I had no idea what was real anymore. The house, the shadows, the whispers, they were all blending together, merging into one overwhelming nightmare that I couldn't escape. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was the woman's face, her empty eyes staring back at me, her twisted grin burning into my mind. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. But how? The silence stretched on, suffocating me, until I heard it, a soft creak. Then another. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from somewhere in the dark. And I knew, with a certainty I could no longer deny, whatever was waiting for me, I had already passed the point of no return. I could hear the footsteps again, slow and methodical, each step lingering in the air like a heartbeat. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with panic. I had no idea where I was. The hallway, the rooms, the very air around me had become a twisted labyrinth. It was as if I had passed through some kind of threshold, and now, no matter which way I turned, I was only getting deeper into the heart of the nightmare. I couldn't escape. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows growing longer, darker, and the air growing colder with every breath. My mind was fractured, pieces of reality slipping through my fingers like sand. I wasn't sure if what I was experiencing was real anymore, or if it was just a hallucination, a twisted creation of my own terror. But the footsteps kept coming, closer now, and my pulse quickened. I pressed my back against the wall, barely daring to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where could I go? The house had become a maze, its structure shifting in unnatural ways. I had no sense of direction. I could be walking in circles for all I knew, chasing something that didn't exist. And then, from the darkened hallway, I saw something move. At first, it was just a shadow, a fleeting figure that seemed to flicker and distort. But as it drew closer, I could see it more clearly, a man, or something that looked like a man. His face was obscured by a tattered hood, his body draped in a cloak so dark it seemed to absorb the light. His footsteps were silent, but they seemed to reverberate in my skull, each one louder than the last. He stopped in front of me, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but I could feel them piercing through me, seeing into my very soul. "I've been waiting for you." His voice was a low rasp, echoing in the vast silence of the house. "You should not have come here." I couldn't speak. My mind was a blur of confusion and fear. Who was he? Why was he here? What did he want from me? He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, and with each step, the air grew heavier. It was as though his presence was suffocating the very space around us, pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice like a whisper in a storm. "This place is a prison. A trap for souls like yours. It's too late for you." I felt a chill run through my veins as his words sank in. A trap for souls. A prison. Was that why the house felt so alive, so wrong? Had I unknowingly walked into something far worse than I could have imagined? I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like something was blocking my throat, a pressure building inside me, suffocating me. "You've been here before," he said, his voice growing louder, more intense. "This place, it's always been here, waiting for you. You can't escape the past. You never could." His words shattered me, and for a moment, I felt as though I was falling through the floor, through the walls, through time itself. I saw flashes, moments, fragments of memories that weren't my own, images of faces I didn't recognize, but felt connected to. A woman, her eyes hollow, her skin pale and cold. A child, lost and alone, calling for help. And then, myself, but not the man I was now. A different version of me, standing in the same place, the same hallway, with the same look of terror in my eyes. I staggered back, trying to comprehend what was happening. My mind was unraveling, the reality around me warping and distorting. The man took another step forward, his presence overwhelming, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me. "This is your fate," he said, his voice rising, as though he were speaking to someone else, someone far away. "You are bound to this place, bound to this nightmare. There is no escape." And then, everything went black. The last thing I remember was the feeling of the ground disappearing beneath my feet, the world spinning out of control. When I woke, I was lying on the cold, damp floor of the house. The air was thick with the same stifling silence, but there was something different now. The oppressive weight was gone, the darkness, the presence, the fear, it had all vanished. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. The house around me was still, as if it had never been alive. But I knew better now. I knew that I had crossed a line, that the house had shown me something I wasn't supposed to see. And I could never unsee it. I turned, looking for a way out, but the door I had entered through was gone. In its place was only a wall, solid and unyielding. I ran my hands across it, desperate, my mind racing. How had it changed? Where was the exit? And then the whispers returned. Soft, distant at first, but growing louder. I couldn't understand them, but I knew what they meant. It wasn't over. Not yet. The house wasn't finished with me. And neither was I. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.